So how do you get new species? The reason I started off by talking about these species concepts is that how do you get a new species really depends on what a species is, what species concept you're working with. When you're using the biological species concept, and that's what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this lecture, when you use the biological species concept, what you care about is interbreeding. Under the biological species concept, reproductive isolation is what delineates a species, what separates a species from every other living thing. Okay, so anything that prevents gene flow between two groups of individuals makes them into separate species. According to the BSC, this is how species come about, is when something stops gene flow between two populations permanently. Within that category of events, isolating barriers, things that stop gene flow between two populations, I want to point out that there are two different categories. There are barriers to gene flow that are prezygotic, and there are barriers to gene flow that are postzygotic. What this means is that some of these barriers work before the zygote forms, before a sperm fertilizes an egg. Okay, they stop gene flow between two species before that happens. Postzygotic isolating barriers are ones that act after fertilization has occurred and there is a hybrid zygote. The reason we care about this difference is because it's really important for the fitness of the parents. Once the zygote is made, a parental investment has been made in that offspring. And so what happens to that offspring matters for the fitness of the parents. If you've got an isolating barrier that acts before the zygote is formed, then that barrier is acting before anybody's made an investment in offspring. And we'll see why that's important in just a bit. There are a number of different kinds of prezygotic isolating barriers. Remember, that's barriers that act before fertilization occurs. One category of this kind of isolating barrier is what's called ecological isolating barriers. Ecological isolation occurs basically because two groups of organisms don't meet. Okay, let's say they use different habitats for breeding, or let's say they reproduce at different times of the year. This weird insect here is a tree hopper. It has this enormous protuberance growing out of its head, perhaps because it is trying to imitate a thorn on a tree. Perhaps it makes it more difficult to eat. And they have an interesting reproductive strategy. They lay their eggs in these slits in the bark in trees. And when the sap starts flowing through the tree again in the spring, that triggers the eggs to hatch, and the plant hoppers emerge, and they mate, and they go on with their lives. What's interesting, though, is that different tree species will leaf out at different times. And so the sap starts flowing through their branches at different times. What this means is that the plant hoppers, the tree hoppers, that have laid their eggs in, say, birch trees, will wake up at one particular time in the spring, and those who have laid their eggs in oak trees will wake up at a different time. Automatically then, because they're using different hosts to lay their eggs in, these two groups of plant hoppers become reproductively isolated from one another. They never meet when the other group is receptive for breeding. Another example might be some frogs. These are three different species of frogs, and you can see here they tend to breed in different months. Okay, perhaps if they all bred at the same time of year, they would be able to exchange genes, but they don't, and so they can't. There's another category of prezygotic isolation that's called sexual isolation. For example, many organisms engage in courtship behavior, and if you don't engage in the right kind of courtship behavior, an individual of the opposite sex is not going to be interested in you. These are insects called lacewings, and they have particular mating calls. These are three different species here, and you can see from these sonograms that the calls of the three different species are really different. If a male from this species is making this sound, a female from this species is not going to be interested in it. And so this gene pool and this gene pool do not exchange alleles. This can be, the sort of sexual isolation can be because of differences in female preferences. It can also be caused by sexual antagonism. When you learned about sexual selection, you learned about that there are some traits that have evolved because males and females are trying to get an edge over one another in terms of controlling reproduction. What can happen is that when females of one species evolve away from males of that same species, not only are they tending to leave those males behind, but they're leaving the males from other species behind. They're evolving traits that make them difficult to mate with. The males of the same species are strongly selected to keep up with these kinds of changes. But other groups of organisms that maybe aren't living in the same location or don't mate all that often with that group of females will become isolated from them evolutionarily because they can no longer deal with the adaptations that those females have to keep the upper hand when it comes to control over mating. You may not think that plants have courtship behavior, but some of them certainly do. There are lots of species that are pollinated by animals of some kind. And they draw a particular kind of animal by the look and the smell and the shape of their flowers. These flowers here are all from species that are quite closely related to one another. But as you can see, some of them look very, very different. When you have, say, a white flower like this, and some of the individuals in a population suddenly evolve, say, red pigment, what you have are two groups of individuals that are very similar genetically, but may draw different pollinators. When that occurs, what you have is one set of pollinators, let's say hummingbirds, that are taking pollen from one red flower to the next red flower to the next red flower, because hummingbirds are attracted to red. This white flower, let's say, is attractive to moths. Moths are often what pollinate white flowers. And here you have moths taking pollen from this flower and skipping right over the red flowers, which they aren't attracted to, and depositing that pollen on a different white flower. So with a simple change in flower morphology or flower color, you can switch from one pollinator to another. And suddenly this new looking flower is sexually isolated from the organisms that are most similar to it, these species with these very different looking flowers. Okay, finally, there are some barriers that function after mating occurs, but before the zygote forms. So they're post-mating, but pre-zygotic. In some insects, what's been proposed is actually a lock and key hypothesis for mating compatibility. What that really means is that in some cases with insects, individuals can try to mate, but fertilization doesn't happen because the male's reproductive parts do not fit the female's reproductive parts. The key does not fit the lock. There are other ways that this can happen. In free-spawning species, you might think that there's really no way of keeping two individuals from mating one another because free spawners are individuals that just release eggs and sperm into the environment, usually water, and when an egg and a sperm meet one another, they fuse. However, in many of these free-spawning species, the sperm from one species just chemically cannot fuse with the egg from another species. They've evolved so that the mechanism of fertilization that the sperm uses and the mechanism of fertilization the egg uses are different. So the mating essentially happens, the sperm and the egg meet, but they can't form a zygote. In some species of plant, the same sort of effect occurs, but it's mediated by a mechanism that's called conspecific sperm precedence. When a pollen grain lands on the stigma of a receptive flower, it sticks there and it starts growing what's called a pollen tube down through the pistil toward the receptive egg cells, the egg cells in these ovules. In many species of plants, the sperm from the same species of plant grows very, very rapidly through the pistil. But pollen from closely related species, if it lands on that stigma, grows much more slowly. And so more often than not, the pollen from the same species, that's what conspecific means. It means within the same species. Okay, that pollen from within the same species wins the race to get a pollen nucleus into that ovule and fertilize the egg cell. There are also mechanisms that isolate two gene pools from one another that occur after the zygote forms. And post-zygotic isolation basically means that the hybrid offspring have very poor fitness. This can happen in two different ways. One of the ways this can happen is simply that the hybrids are inviable. They don't survive well. So when individuals from two different gene pools mate and the offspring tend not to survive, that's called hybrid inviability. And this can happen for a couple of different reasons. One is it can happen for intrinsic reasons. When you have a population over here and a population over here, and they've been evolving separately for long periods of time, what can happen is that an allele over in this population can become fixed that is not good at working together with an allele that becomes fixed over here. So after these two species kind of separate ways, they haven't seen each other for a while, they evolve alleles, or they evolve genes that don't work well together. And so if they try to mate subsequently, they're not able to make a really well-functioning hybrid offspring. There are also extrinsic reasons why hybrids might be less fit, why they might have trouble surviving. If you have organisms from one environment mating with organisms that from a different environment, all of their genes might play well together. They might be able to make an offspring that is perfectly functional, but the offspring isn't good at making a living in either one of the environments. Okay, so for example, in one species of fish, there are benthic forms that swim along the bottom, and there are limnetic forms that swim in the open water. It's possible for them to mate, but their offspring have trouble getting food down along the bottom, and they have trouble getting food in the open water. So they simply aren't able to feed themselves very well. The second way that you can shut off gene flow between two species after fertilization has already occurred is if the hybrids have trouble having offspring. The famous example, of course, is when you cross a horse with a donkey and you get a mule. Mules are of perfectly good viability. They're hardy animals, but they're completely sterile. They can never have offspring. Hybrid sterility doesn't have to be complete. There are lots of cases where two species interbreed and they produce an offspring and it can reproduce, but it just does so poorly. It can't have very many offspring. That tends to shut down gene flow between this parent species and this other parent species.